Hey YouTube, welcome back to my kitchen. Tonight I'm going to be getting some pizza dough ready. I've never tried to cold ferment dough before, but that's going to be our project. Tomorrow night we'll be having pizza night, and I'm going to be showing you the whole pizza recipe. So we're going to get our pizza dough ready. I'll show you the ingredients and how to whip that together, and then it'll sit in the fridge overnight. You can do this for up to 5 nights. The longer you let it ferment in your fridge, the stronger it will be. One other thing I wanted to make a note of before I forget, I'm going to be adding just a little bit extra yeast because it'll be cold, so the yeast will be kind of dormant, and I don't know if, I'm not quite sure how long I'll have to let it rise to get up to the size of the pizza dough that I want. So I'm just going to add a little bit extra as a safeguard. Let me go ahead and get set up and we'll get started. I'll be posting a link to the recipe in the description box, but I wanted to make a note before I started. I'll be making 2/3 batch of that recipe. So to start, we'll need 2 cups of bread flour, 2 tablespoons of olive oil, half a teaspoon of sugar, a teaspoon of salt, and 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 teaspoons of yeast. Also, 2/3 of a cup of water. Quick note, because I'm using bread flour, I'll probably have to add an extra tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of water once my dough is mixing, but if you're using all-purpose flour, which is totally fine, you can probably stick with a 2/3 cup of water. It also depends on how humid it is outside that day, so it also rained all day today, so it's wet outside, so maybe I can get away with just 2/3 cups, but we will see when we get there. I'm warming up the water in the microwave right now, just warm, not hot, and we'll be adding the salt, sugar, and yeast in just a second. So to our warm water, we will add half a teaspoon of sugar, a teaspoon of salt, give this a good stir. I want to try to dissolve the sugar in the water before I add the yeast because the yeast is going to eat the sugar. And actually the sugar is what ferments in the dough, so I want to make sure it's well distributed. And then I'll add the yeast, and I'm going to check the temp real quick. It's warm, it's not hot, salty. 2 teaspoons and a half, which is a little bit more than the recipe calls for, but I think I mentioned earlier I'm adding just a little bit of extra yeast just in case the chilling process sort of affects that, and I don't want it to be a small ball. I want it to be like I would normally expect, just kind of fermented overnight in the fridge. We'll let this sit for about 5 minutes while we get our dry ingredients ready. I said dry ingredients, but really all that's going in here is the 2 cups of flour and the 2 tablespoons of oil, and I'll get that nice and mixed up. And then once our yeast has had time to activate, because I'm using active dry yeast, I'm using active dry, it's not instant yeast, so it has to have time to activate. So before I add the yeast, I'll mix the oil in. You do not want to add the oil to the yeast mixture because it will coat the yeast and it'll have trouble converting the sugars. So make sure you add your oil to your flour mixture. Okay, now here's our yeast mixture. Check out those things floating around in there. It has expanded. Still a little dry on top, so I'll give it a quick mix. Make sure I'm not losing any yeast to the sides of the cup. And then I'll go ahead and get this added to the dry, and mix it until it's well combined and it's smooth and elastic. And once it has formed itself into a ball and has pulled all of the dough away from the sides, I would let it go for another few minutes as kind of a kneading process. The formation of gluten is very important in this, and that's also why I'm using bread flour. It has a higher protein content, so we're gonna get a much sturdier crust, even though we're gonna keep it as thin as we can. So I wanna let this develop a lot of gluten, which the more you work the dough, the more gluten develops. So I'll go ahead and get this added. Alright, that looks really good to me, and it feels pretty good too. Feels like it's the right consistency, the right texture, it's a little bit stretchy. So I'm going to shape this into a ball. Make sure you close the bottom end. It will seal. It may not look like it's gonna seal, but it will as it rises. And then the very last step is to coat your bowl in oil and a little bit on the dough as well, to keep the dough from sticking to the sides of the bowl and to keep the dough from drying out. So I usually just drizzle a little on top of the dough and then give it a few spins in the bowl to kind of get it up on the sides. And I can tell that's the bottom of my dough ball, so I will cover this with a dish towel and let this rise until we're ready to make pizza tomorrow night. If by chance you do not want to cold ferment your dough and you want to cook this dough tonight, the same night that you're making it, then you can cover it with a towel and let it rise in a warm place for about an hour. And once it has about doubled in size, you can punch it down a little bit, stretch it out to the size of your pizza pan, top it with whatever toppings you're gonna use, and go ahead and bake it. And I would bake it as hot as your oven goes for about 10 minutes. Usually what we do is we will turn it on broil and then put it in the oven for about 8 minutes, spinning it halfway, and then put it in the broiler for the remaining couple of minutes, spinning it halfway. Alright, it's the next day and we are back for the sauce. I like to get this ready a little bit before we're ready to stretch the dough, just so that there's time for the sauce to cool, so that we're not putting very hot sauce on room temp dough. But what we're going to need for this is 2 tablespoons of grated Parmesan, 2 ounces of blue cheese of your choice. This is blue cheese that we home smoked, I think it was a week ago, maybe it was 2 weeks ago now. I'm going to be using my cheese grater to grate up the Parmesan. This can be crumbled, and I'm going to be weighing out my 2 ounces of blue cheese with my scale. Looking back at this now, I realized it would have been way easier for me to grate up my Parmesan first in the bowl so that I could put my cheese grater down flat and then turn my scale on with the cheese in the bowl already, and it will come up to 0. And then I would just weigh out 2 ounces of the blue cheese. And I'm pretty picky about my blue cheese, and I've made this several times before. And if blue cheese is very strong for you, you can cut back on that. And also the Parmesan does a really nice job of mellowing out that sharpness of the blue cheese. So you can alter the ratio to however you like it. I may add a little bit extra Parmesan, we'll see. I always taste my food as I'm cooking, so once this all melts down, then I'll give it a taste and see what it needs. I've also chopped up 1 garlic clove. I'm gonna heat this up in some olive oil before I add all of my cream and cheeses just to give it a little garlic kick. Now you don't want to get this just rip-roaring hot because we are going to be adding heavy cream and you don't want it to curdle, but you do want it to get warm enough to cook the garlic a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and get my cream measured so that I can add it quickly after the garlic's added, and then I'll toss my garlic in.
Now you'll see here I'm adding the cream in batches, and the first one is very small. I'm just trying to cool off the pan so that the rest of the cream doesn't curdle. There's just a little bit more, making a mess off camera. Stir frequently so that it doesn't stick to the bottom or scorch. And once the mixture is cooled, you can go ahead and add the rest of that cream. Next we'll add our cheeses. And give it another good stir, and we'll just let this cook for a little bit, warm it up, and let the cheeses melt. And you'll want a gentle simmer until the cream has thickened. You'll see in this clip, the sauce is starting to thicken up pretty nicely. It's coating the back of the spoon pretty well, but it's still pretty watery when it's dripping, so I'm going to let it go just a little bit longer. I am just going to add a little bit of white pepper, black pepper, and onion powder to taste. Alright, this is a pretty good demonstration of how thick you want this sauce to be when it's still warm. It coats the spoon nicely, it's not quite as watery, it's a little bit of a slower drip, and you'll see how much thicker that is, and this will thicken up even more as it cools. We want to put it on the pizza after it's cooled down to room temperature. Now is also a good time to taste it for seasoning. And when we're happy with that, we'll take it off the heat. Time to move on to the next ingredient. I'm going to be slicing up these klobase and cooking them, not so that they're fully cooked, but just browning them on the outside. They'll finish cooking when the pizza is baking in the oven, but I just want to give them a head start. And we won't be using all of these today for the pizza, but I'm going to go ahead and cook the whole batch, and I'll use the rest of them for Cajun pasta. Side note, the real recipe calls for andouille sausage, not klobase, but this is what I have, so this is what I'm using. Alright, once all the sausage is sliced to your liking, it's time to cook it on a skillet, medium to high heat, for just a couple minutes per side. Once we're done with our sausage, we'll get our next ingredient ready, which is super simple. It's just, in this case, chopped white onion. The recipe calls for green onion, but again, I'm participating in a pantry challenge, and I didn't have green onion on hand, so I'm just using white onion. Next, I'll shred this ball of mozzarella for the topping. This is actually a ball of smoked mozzarella. We smoked it along with a blue cheese and several other cheeses. I actually have a video about that, and I will put a link to it in the description and also in this video. Next, we're going to get our shrimp ready, and these are raw shrimp already peeled and deveined. I'm going to season them with poultry seasoning, some Italian seasoning, white pepper, black pepper, paprika, some salt, and then coat it with a little olive oil and give it a good stir. If you're cold fermenting your dough, you're going to want to take that out of the fridge at least 30 minutes to an hour before you are ready to stretch the dough, just to make it a little bit easier to work with. When you're ready to stretch the dough, we'll want to coat our pizza pan with olive oil, and I mean a lot of olive oil. You don't want your pizza to stick to the bottom of this. Once your pan is oiled, grab your dough and start stretching it from the inside outwards. So you'll want to try to make it as thin as you can without breaking any holes in the center of the dough first, and then find any thick pieces and try and stretch that out. If you get a spot like I've got here in the bottom part of the pizza, I try to fix it just then. If you've got a spot like that is on the verge of breaking into a hole, you can tear off a part of the outer crust and fill that gap. Once you're satisfied with the shape of the dough and the thickness of the crust, you'll want to poke it all over with a fork to prevent any air bubbles. And then we can start spooning on the sauce. The next step is to spread out the mozzarella. Next, we'll evenly distribute the sausage. Then we'll add our Cajun shrimp. Make sure you're getting your toppings all the way to the edges. Next, we'll add our onions. If you're using green onions, those will be put onto the pizza after it comes out of the oven. And I'm going to put this in the preheated oven for about 6 minutes, spinning it halfway, and then I will take it out when the timer goes off and brush our garlic butter on the crust. And this is just 2 tablespoons of butter, and I sprinkle in a little garlic powder, onion powder, and salt. This usually takes me about 1 to 2 minutes to do, and then when I'm putting the pizza back in, I'll put it into the broiler and let it finish in the broiler. Make sure to give it a good spin to cook it evenly and get all of the edges brown. And when the cheese is nice and golden brown and it looks good, then you can take it out and it's ready. My husband likes to loosen the pizza from the pan pretty soon after it comes out of the oven, and he's using a spatula to do that. Also, just a side note, if you've got one of these air pans with the holes in the bottom, I would recommend that you try to avoid pushing the raw dough down, because it can sometimes push the dough through the holes and make it seem like it's sticking to the pan. Really, it's just pressed through the holes. I chopped some parsley up and threw some on top just for a little pretty green effect on the pizza. Well guys, thanks so much for hanging out with me in my kitchen today. I hope you liked this video. If you did, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe if you're new around here. And I will see you next time.